Have you ever been treated like you don't matter by the very people who are supposed to love you unconditionally? Have you ever smiled through tears while your own family made you the punchline of their cruel entertainment, year after year, gathering after gathering, until you couldn't recognize yourself anymore? Let me tell you something that took me 32 years to understand. Being related to someone doesn't give them a lifetime pass to destroy your soul piece by piece, while calling it love, while calling it fun, while telling you to just take a joke. My name is Sarah, and I spent most of my life as my family's emotional punching bag, their stress relief, their favorite source of amusement at my own expense. I was the one they could always count on to absorb their mockery with a forced smile, to be the butt of every joke at every holiday dinner, to shrink myself smaller and smaller until I practically disappeared, just to avoid giving them more ammunition. But something inside me finally broke, or maybe it finally healed, and I did something that changed everything. I turned their idea of harmless fun into a detailed payment plan, an itemized invoice for every wound they inflicted while laughing. And what happened next revealed truths about my family that I had been too afraid to see for decades. This is the story of how I stopped being a victim and started demanding the respect I should have received from birth. And I'm sharing it because I know I'm not alone in this pain. Because somewhere out there, someone else is suffering through the same torture disguised as family bonding. And they need to know that it's okay to say, enough is enough. I need you to understand something before I go any further into this story. When I say I was the family punching bag, I don't mean it as a casual metaphor or an exaggeration for dramatic effect. I mean that from the moment I could form coherent memories, I was designated as the one person in our family who existed solely for everyone else's amusement, whose feelings were considered less important than a good laugh, whose dignity was sacrificed repeatedly on the altar of family tradition. It started so early that I can't even pinpoint an exact beginning, which is perhaps the most insidious part of this whole nightmare. There was no single moment where someone sat me down and said, "Sarah, we've decided that you're going to be the one we mock relentlessly for our entertainment," because that would have been too honest, too obvious, too hard to deny later when I finally found the courage to object. Instead, it crept into my life like a slow-growing poison, normalized and naturalized until it became as much a part of family gatherings as my grandmother's apple pie or my uncle's terrible dad jokes. The earliest memory I have of this dynamic playing out is from when I was maybe 5 or 6 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with my siblings while my mother prepared dinner. I had just started losing my baby teeth, and one of my front teeth had come out that morning, leaving me with that adorable gap-toothed smile that most parents find endearing. But when I smiled at something my older brother said, excited to be included in the conversation, he pointed at my face and started laughing hysterically. Not the warm, affectionate laughter of a family enjoying a cute moment together, but cruel, mocking laughter that made my stomach drop even at that young age. Within seconds, my sister joined in, and then my father walked into the room, and instead of defending me or redirecting the conversation, he looked at me and said, "Well, you do look pretty ridiculous, sweetheart." And just like that, my appearance became fair game for family mockery. That incident might seem small or insignificant when isolated and examined on its own, the kind of thoughtless comment that many families make without realizing the impact, but it established a pattern that would define my entire childhood and follow me well into adulthood. It taught me that my feelings were secondary to everyone else's entertainment, that my embarrassment was fuel for family bonding, that my role was to take the hit so others could feel superior. As I grew older, the teasing evolved and expanded to cover every aspect of my existence. My weight became a constant source of commentary, even when I was a perfectly healthy, normal child. If I reached for a second helping at dinner, someone would make a joke about me eating for two or reference my healthy appetite with a smirk. If I wore something I felt confident in, my siblings would find something to criticize, whether it was the color clashing with my complexion or the style being inappropriate for my body type. My interests were mocked relentlessly. When I showed enthusiasm for art and spent hours drawing in my room, my father called it a waste of time, and my brother dubbed me Sarah the Starving Artist at age 12, a nickname that stuck for years. When I struggled with math in school, it became fodder for dinner table discussions where my intelligence was openly questioned while everyone else laughed. The worst part wasn't even the content of the jokes themselves, though those stung deeply enough to leave scars I'm still discovering today. The worst part was the gaslighting that came whenever I tried to express that I was hurt. If I teared up or asked them to stop, I was told I was too sensitive, that I couldn't take a joke, that everyone gets teased in families and I needed to toughen up. If I got angry and snapped back, I was punished for being disrespectful or told I was ruining the family fun with my bad attitude. There was literally no response I could give that was considered acceptable, except silent acceptance of my designated role as the family's emotional dartboard. The teenage years were particularly brutal because adolescence is already such a vulnerable time, when you're trying to figure out who you are and where you fit in the world, when peer acceptance feels like a matter of life and death, when your self-image is forming in ways that will impact you for the rest of your life. Instead of getting support and encouragement from my family during this crucial developmental period, I got amplified mockery that targeted my changing body, my awkward social skills, my failed attempts at dating, my every insecurity laid bare for family entertainment. I remember being 16 and getting asked to the prom by a boy I had been crushing on for months, feeling absolutely elated and beautiful for maybe the first time in my life. I came home bursting with excitement to share the news, and my mother's first response was, "Well, he must have lost a bet," delivered with a laugh that suggested she was joking, but everyone knew she wasn't. My sister chimed in with concerns about whether they even made prom dresses in my size, and my brother warned my date would probably ditch me halfway through the night when he realized what a mistake he'd made. By the time they were done with their fun, I had gone from feeling like Cinderella going to the ball to feeling like a charity case who should be grateful anyone was willing to be seen with me. I went to that prom, but I couldn't enjoy a single moment of it because their voices echoed in my head all night, confirming every insecurity and poisoning what should have been a magical memory. That's what they stole from me, you see, not just my comfort in the moment, but my ability to experience joy, to trust compliments, to believe I deserved good things, to take up space in the world without apologizing for my existence. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you ever watched your siblings get praised for achievements while yours were dismissed? Seen them receive support for their dreams while yours were ridiculed? Noticed how their feelings were validated while yours were treated as inconvenient overreactions? Comment below if this resonates with you because I need you to know you're not alone, that your experience is valid even if your family tells you otherwise. The pattern continued through my college years, even though I deliberately chose a university several hours away specifically to escape the constant negativity. I thought distance would help, that maybe if I could build a life away from their daily influence, I could finally develop some self-esteem and discover who I actually was, beneath all the shame and self-doubt they had layered onto me. For a while, it seemed to work. I made friends who actually seemed to like me, joined clubs where my contributions were valued, even dated someone who treated me with genuine kindness and respect. But then the holidays would roll around and I'd return home, and within hours of walking through the door, I'd transform back into the same diminished version of myself, shrinking and apologizing and accepting whatever they dished out. The comments during those visits were especially cutting because they now had months of my life to pick apart. They mocked my choice of major, calling it impractical and asking when I was going to get a real education. They criticized my friends based solely on their appearance in photos, making assumptions about their character and intelligence. They interrogated me about my romantic life in ways that felt invasive and humiliating, turning my relationships into spectacles for their amusement. My boyfriend at the time came home with me for Thanksgiving during my junior year, and I watched in horror as my family performed their usual routine, making jokes at my expense right in front of him, treating him to the full display of how little they respected me. He broke up with me 2 weeks later, and while he gave other reasons, I couldn't shake the feeling that witnessing my family's treatment of me had shown him I wasn't worth respecting either. The pattern followed me into adulthood, into my career, into my adult relationships and friendships. No matter how much success I achieved professionally, how much personal growth I accomplished, how much therapy I underwent to try to heal from the damage, my family remained committed to their established dynamic. I became a successful marketing director at a respected firm, but at family gatherings, my career was reduced to Sarah makes pretty posters, with accompanying laughter. I lost 50 pounds through dedicated effort and lifestyle changes, but instead of congratulations, I got comments about how I'd probably gain it all back plus more, because I always gave up on things. I bought my first house at 31, a beautiful 3-bedroom Craftsman that I was incredibly proud of, and my father's response was to walk through it, pointing out everything I'd overpaid for and predicting I'd be in foreclosure within 2 years. The mechanism was always the same. Take whatever Sarah is proud of, whatever Sarah has worked hard for, whatever Sarah has accomplished, and find a way to diminish it, to poison it, to ensure she knows that nothing she does will ever be good enough to earn actual respect or genuine celebration from this family. And the worst part, the absolute worst part that I'm still ashamed to admit, is that I kept showing up. I kept coming back for more. I kept hoping that maybe this time would be different. that maybe if I just achieved enough or lost enough weight or made enough money or said the right thing in the right way, they would finally see me as worthy of basic human dignity. I was addicted to the hope that my own family might someday love me the way I desperately needed to be loved, the way I saw them love each other, and that addiction kept me trapped in an abusive dynamic for over 3 decades. The shift began about 8 months ago, though I didn't recognize it as the beginning of my liberation at the time. I had started seeing a new therapist, Dr. Martinez, after my previous therapist retired, and she had a very different approach to my family issues than any mental health professional I'd worked with before. Where previous therapists had focused on teaching me coping mechanisms to handle my family's behavior, on breathing exercises and cognitive reframing, and finding ways to not let their words hurt me so much, Dr. Martinez asked me a question that I still remember with perfect clarity because it detonated something in my brain. She looked at me after I'd spent 40 minutes describing yet another painful family gathering and asked, "Sarah, if a friend told you that people in her life treated her exactly the way your family treats you, what would you advise her to do?" The question seemed simple at first, almost absurdly simple, but as I opened my mouth to answer, I realized I would tell that friend to get away from those people immediately, to recognize the relationship as abusive and cut contact without hesitation. I would never, ever advise someone I cared about to keep subjecting themselves to that treatment just because it came from family. I would call it what it was: emotional abuse, systematic degradation, psychological torture disguised as tradition. But I had never applied that same standard to my own situation because we're taught that family is different, that blood relations come with different rules, that we owe our family members unlimited chances and unconditional forgiveness no matter how much they hurt us. Dr. Martinez helped me see that I had been living with a double standard that was destroying me, that I had been giving my family permissions to abuse me that I would never grant to anyone else in my life. Over the following months, I started doing deep work in therapy around recognizing the patterns, naming the abuse, understanding how it had shaped my entire worldview and sense of self. I began journaling obsessively, writing down every instance I could remember of being mocked, belittled, or humiliated by my family, and the document grew to over 100 pages. I wrote about the time my mother told me I'd never get married because I was too difficult, the countless occasions my father compared me unfavorably to my siblings, the family reunion where my extended family spent an hour sharing their favorite Sarah stories that were really just humiliating moments from my life presented as entertainment. I documented how my brother had given me the silent treatment for an entire Christmas because I had asked him to stop making fat jokes, how my sister had uninvited me to her wedding party after I gained weight because she wanted her bridesmaids to look good in photos, how my parents had openly discussed their disappointment in me at a family dinner while I sat right there at the table. Reading through these memories collected in one place was devastating, but also clarifying, because I could no longer pretend this was normal family teasing or that I was overreacting. This was systematic, sustained psychological abuse that had lasted my entire life, and it had nearly destroyed me. I had panic attacks reading my own documentation, but I also felt something new stirring inside me: anger. Not the wounded, helpless anger of a child being mistreated, but the righteous fury of an adult recognizing injustice and refusing to accept it any longer. Dr. Martinez and I discussed strategies for setting boundaries with my family, for potentially limiting contact or even going no contact if necessary, but something in me resisted the idea of just walking away without making them understand what they had done. I knew that if I simply stopped showing up to family events, they would craft a narrative where I was the problem, the oversensitive daughter who couldn't take a joke, the ungrateful child who abandoned her loving family over nothing. They would become the victims in their own story, and I would remain the villain or the crazy one, and they would never have to confront the reality of their behavior. I wanted accountability, recognition, consequences. I wanted them to face what they had done in a way they couldn't dismiss or reframe. That desire might seem petty or vindictive to some people, and maybe it was, but after 32 years of swallowing my pain to make them comfortable, I had earned the right to make them uncomfortable for once. The idea came to me during a particularly difficult therapy session where we were discussing how our capitalist society tends to only recognize harm when it can be quantified in dollars, how emotional and psychological damage is treated as less real than financial or physical damage. Dr. Martinez mentioned, somewhat sarcastically, that too bad I couldn't just send them an invoice for the therapy bills they'd caused, and something clicked in my mind. Why couldn't I? Why couldn't I create a literal accounting of what their behavior had cost me, not just emotionally, but in actual measurable terms? The more I thought about it, the more the idea took hold, growing from a bitter fantasy into an actual plan that felt both cathartic and just. I spent the next 6 weeks creating what I started calling the invoice, though it became so much more than a simple bill. I opened a spreadsheet and began documenting everything. Every incident I could remember with as much detail as possible, assigning dates where I could remember them or approximate timeframes where I couldn't, describing each event and its impact on me. Then came the harder part, assigning monetary value to my pain. I started with the quantifiable costs, the therapy bills I'd been paying for years to recover from their treatment, which totaled over $40,000 by my calculation, sessions at an average of $150 per week for over 5 years. The medication I'd been prescribed for depression and anxiety that I could directly trace to family-related trauma, another several $1,000s over the years. The career opportunities I'd turned down or self-sabotaged because their voices in my head told me I wasn't good enough, which I conservatively estimated had cost me at least $100,000 in lost income. The wedding I'd called off at the last minute because I couldn't bear the thought of my family's mockery during such a vulnerable moment, losing deposits and payments that totaled nearly $15,000. But then I went deeper, into the less tangible but equally real costs. I researched jury awards in emotional distress cases to get a sense of how courts valued psychological harm. I looked at what people charge for professional consulting, public speaking, and creative work, and I assigned those rates to the countless hours I'd spent managing their emotions, absorbing their stress, and providing them with entertainment at my expense. Each line item in the invoice was meticulously detailed and justified. For example, Thanksgiving 2019, comments about my weight in front of extended family resulting in panic attack and 3 emergency therapy sessions, $450. Or June 2015, mocking my career choice and predicting my failure, leading to 6 months of self-doubt and nearly quitting my job, $5,000 in lost professional development and estimated future earnings. Or Sweet 16 party, humiliating speech by brother describing me as the family disappointment, resulting in ongoing social anxiety, $12,000 in therapy costs and medication. I included every birthday where my gifts were openly mocked, every achievement that was dismissed, every relationship they sabotaged with their treatment of me, every single time they chose their momentary amusement over my fundamental dignity as a human being. The invoice grew to 17 pages with over 200 individual line items, and the total came to just over $347,000. Looking at that number, I felt vindicated and sick at the same time, because while part of me knew I was being perfectly fair in my accounting, another part of me couldn't believe the damage added up to so much, couldn't believe I had absorbed that level of abuse for so long while calling it love. I added a cover letter explaining the invoice, written in the professional tone I used for work communications, stating that this represented my final attempt to communicate the real cost of their behavior, and that payment could be made in either sincere apologies and changed behavior or actual financial compensation for damages rendered, their choice. I knew they'd never pay a cent, but that wasn't really the point. The point was making them see, in terms they couldn't easily dismiss, exactly what they had done to me. My hands were shaking when I sent the invoice to my parents, siblings, and several extended family members who had participated in the mockery over the years. I used certified mail so there would be proof of delivery, so they couldn't claim they never received it. And I sent it exactly 2 weeks before our annual family Christmas gathering, timing it deliberately to give them time to process it, before we were all in the same room. Then I waited, my stomach in knots, alternating between feeling powerful and terrified, convinced I'd made a huge mistake 1 minute and certain I'd done the right thing the next. Dr. Martinez reminded me that I was breaking a family system that had been in place for decades, that systems don't change without resistance, that I should expect an intense reaction. She was right, but even with that preparation, I wasn't ready for what came next. The first response came from my brother via text, 2 days after he would have received the invoice. "Are you fucking kidding me with this? You're actually insane. Get help." Short, dismissive, exactly what I should have expected, but it still stung to see my pain reduced to insanity. My sister called the next day, and I made the mistake of answering. She was crying, actually crying, telling me how hurt she was that I would attack the family like this, how cruel I was being, how I was trying to extort them for money over jokes that everyone knew were harmless. When I tried to explain that the invoice represented decades of genuine harm, she talked over me, saying I had always been too sensitive, that everyone gets teased in families, that I was choosing to be a victim instead of just getting over it like a normal person. She said I was ruining Christmas, destroying the family, and breaking our mother's heart with my selfishness. And then she hung up before I could respond. My mother's response came in the form of a long email that I've read approximately 50 times, trying to find any hint of understanding or accountability, and finding none. She wrote about how shocked and hurt she was to receive such a hateful document from her own daughter, how she had always done her best as a mother and didn't deserve this attack. She listed all the things she'd done for me over the years, the sacrifices she'd made, the love she'd shown, using them as evidence that I was being ungrateful and unreasonable. She said that all families tease each other and that I needed to develop a thicker skin instead of blaming others for my problems. She suggested I was having some kind of breakdown and needed to get back on my medication, a particularly cruel jab since she knew I had struggled with finding the right medication for years and felt sensitive about it. She ended the email by saying that I was welcome at Christmas if I came ready to apologize for this stunt and commit to being a more positive presence in the family. But if I couldn't do that, perhaps it was better if I stayed home. My father didn't respond at all initially, which was somehow worse than the others' reactions. That wall of silence that suggested I wasn't even worth acknowledging. The extended family members I'd sent invoices to had various reactions ranging from confused texts asking if this was some kind of joke to angry voicemails telling me I was out of line and owed everyone apologies. Not a single person, not one, responded with anything resembling recognition of the pain I'd documented or willingness to consider that maybe, just maybe, their behavior had been harmful. The 2 weeks between sending the invoice and Christmas were among the most difficult of my life, because I was facing the full force of the family system, trying to reject the truth I'd presented and return to the comfortable dynamic where I absorbed abuse in silence. My phone blew up with messages from various family members, some trying the guilt approach, others trying anger, a few attempting to love bomb me back into compliance by suddenly being sweet and telling me how much they loved and missed me. I got texts from cousins I hadn't heard from in years, clearly recruited by my parents to convince me I was wrong. My aunt called to tell me that I was being manipulated by my therapist, who obviously had some agenda against families, and I should stop seeing her immediately. My grandmother left a voicemail crying about how I was tearing the family apart and how she didn't have many Christmases left, and did I really want her last memories to be of family conflict. Every angle was covered, every manipulation technique employed, all designed to make me back down, apologize, and return to my designated role. The pressure was immense, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't waver, didn't consider just withdrawing the invoice and showing up to Christmas with an apology as my mother had demanded. The voice of the scared little girl inside me who just wanted her family to love her was screaming at me to give in, to do whatever it took to stop the conflict and return to the familiar pain that at least came with the comfort of family connection. But Dr. Martinez helped me stay strong, reminding me that this reaction was exactly what we'd predicted, that their desperate attempt to maintain the status quo was actually proof that I'd hit a nerve, that the invoice had worked, even if not in the way I'd hoped. As Christmas approached, I made the decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was going to attend the family gathering, but on my terms. I wasn't going to apologize, I wasn't going to back down, and I wasn't going to accept their attempts to Ruga sweep what I'd revealed. I prepared myself emotionally, role-playing different scenarios with Dr. Martinez, planning my responses to various attacks, committing to staying calm and factual no matter how much they tried to provoke me. I also made a backup plan with my best friend Monica, who agreed to be on standby to pick me up if things got too intense and I needed to leave. The night before Christmas Eve, I barely slept, running through every possible confrontation in my mind, imagining everything from tears and apologies to complete rejection and disownment. What I wasn't prepared for, what I couldn't have anticipated, was the eerie sense of pretending everything was normal that greeted me when I walked into my parents' house for Christmas Eve dinner. Everyone was there, the whole family gathered as tradition dictated, and when I walked in, they all greeted me with smiles and hugs like nothing had happened. My mother kissed my cheek and took my coat. My father asked about traffic. My siblings waved from the living room where they were watching football. It was so aggressively normal that I felt like I was losing my mind, like maybe I'd imagined sending the invoice, like maybe this was some kind of psychological test I was failing. I stood in the entryway, completely disoriented, wondering if I was supposed to just go along with the charade or if I should bring up the elephant in the room. The answer came about 30 minutes later when my brother made a joke about my outfit. Nothing too harsh, but clearly testing the waters, seeing if the old dynamic could be restored. Everyone's eyes turned to me, waiting to see how I'd react. And in that moment, I realized this was the real confrontation. Not a dramatic showdown, but a subtle power struggle over whether the family system would bend to acknowledge reality, or if I would bend back into my old role. I took a breath and said, calmly and clearly, "That's number 237 on the invoice, actually," mocking my appearance. "Did you read the document I sent?" The room went silent, that heavy silence where you can hear people breathing, and my brother's face went red. He started to say something defensive, but my mother cut him off, her voice tight and controlled as she said, "Sarah, we agreed we weren't going to do this tonight. This is Christmas, and we're going to have a nice family evening." I felt my resolve strengthen as I responded, "I never agreed to that, Mom. You demanded I apologize and pretend everything is fine, but I'm not doing that anymore. The invoice stands, and if you want me to be part of this family going forward, we need to talk about it." My father finally spoke up, his tone dismissive in that way he'd perfected over decades. "That ridiculous invoice? Sarah, nobody is taking that seriously. It's absurd and you know it." I had prepared for this, pulled out my phone where I had stored a copy, and started reading some of the line items out loud, forcing them to hear their own behavior described in objective terms, forcing them to confront what they'd done in front of each other. My mother tried to stop me, her voice rising. "Sarah, stop this right now. You're embarrassing yourself and ruining Christmas." But I kept reading, my voice steady even though I was shaking inside, reading about the time my father told me I'd never amount to anything, about my sister excluding me from her wedding party, about my brother's relentless mockery of my weight, about decades of systematic degradation disguised as family bonding. The room erupted into chaos, everyone talking at once. Some family members trying to defend themselves while others tried to shut down the conversation entirely. My mother crying and saying I was attacking her, my siblings angry and defensive, extended family members uncomfortable and trying to change the subject. In the middle of it all, I stood firm, no longer the scared little girl desperate for their approval, but an adult woman demanding accountability. My uncle, my mother's brother, who had always been one of the worst offenders in the extended family mockery, stood up and pointed at me, his face purple with rage as he said I was ungrateful, disrespectful, and clearly mentally unstable, that I needed to leave before I caused any more damage. I looked at him and said something I'd been wanting to say for 20 years. "The only damage being caused here is the damage you all have been inflicting on me my entire life, and the only instability is the unstable foundation of cruelty this family is built on." Then I turned to my parents and said what I'd practiced with Dr. Martinez. "I love you all, but I can't keep sacrificing my mental health for your comfort. The invoice is real, the harm is real, and until you can acknowledge that and commit to change, I can't be part of this dynamic anymore." My mother was crying harder now, accusing me of being cruel and destroying the family. But I noticed something interesting. My younger cousin Emma, who was about 19 and had been quiet in the corner, was nodding slightly, her eyes wet with tears that I suspected were tears of recognition rather than sadness. The evening didn't end with some magical moment of family reconciliation where everyone apologized and promised to change. Instead, it ended with me leaving after about 2 hours, my mother refusing to speak to me, my father shaking his head in disappointment, my siblings angry and defensive. But something had shifted fundamentally in the family system, even if they weren't ready to admit it yet. Over the following weeks, the fallout continued in predictable ways. My parents issued an ultimatum through my sister: apologize for the invoice and the scene at Christmas, or accept that I was choosing to separate from the family. Most of my siblings sided with my parents, though my youngest brother sent me a text saying he didn't really understand what I was upset about, but he hoped I was okay. Extended family members mostly avoided me, unwilling to take sides but clearly uncomfortable with the conflict. I lost invitations to family events, got excluded from group chats, felt the cold shoulder of familial rejection that's supposed to motivate you to comply and return to your designated role. But here's what they didn't expect. I felt relieved. The anxiety that had plagued me before every family gathering was gone because there were no more gatherings to dread. The depression that came from repeatedly being disrespected by people I loved started to lift because I was no longer subjecting myself to that treatment. The constant voice in my head telling me I wasn't good enough got quieter because I was no longer receiving regular reinforcement of that message from my family. For the first time in my life, I had space to breathe, to figure out who I was without their constant negative input, to build a life based on my own values rather than their dysfunction. But the story doesn't end there, because about 6 weeks after Christmas, I got a call from that cousin Emma who had been crying quietly in the corner. She asked if we could meet for coffee, and when we did, she told me something that changed my perspective on everything. She said that watching me stand up to the family had been the bravest thing she'd ever seen, that she had been experiencing similar treatment as the youngest and newest target now that I was asserting boundaries, and that my invoice had given her language to understand what was happening to her. She said she'd started keeping her own documentation of incidents, working with a counselor at her college, and planning her own exit from the toxic family system. We cried together, two survivors of the same abuse, separated by a generation but united in our determination to break the cycle. She introduced me to a few other younger cousins who reached out after hearing about what I'd done, and I discovered that I wasn't the only one who had suffered, just the only one who had been the primary target for so long. There was a whole network of family members, mostly the younger generation and those who had married in, who had been hurt by the family's culture of mockery but felt powerless to challenge it. Together, we started our own support group, meeting monthly to share experiences and encourage each other in maintaining healthy boundaries. What started as my individual act of rebellion became a catalyst for broader change, not in the family's willingness to acknowledge their behavior, but in the willingness of their victims to stop accepting it. Have you ever discovered that your pain helped someone else find their voice? Have you ever realized that standing up for yourself gave others permission to do the same? Drop a comment sharing your experience because collective healing is powerful, and knowing you're not alone can change everything. The invoice itself never got paid, of course. Not in money, and not in the apologies and changed behavior I'd listed as acceptable alternatives. My parents and most of my siblings remain convinced that I'm the problem, that I've been brainwashed by therapy, that I'm too sensitive and chose to destroy the family over harmless jokes. They've crafted their own narrative where they're the victims of my unreasonable demands and cruel accusations. But here's what's interesting. The way they interact with the younger family members has changed slightly, subtly, in ways they probably don't even recognize. There's a little less casual mockery, a little more awareness that not everyone thinks it's funny, a crack in the foundation of the system even if they won't admit it. My mother has tried to reach out a few times, always with the same message. She misses me. The family isn't the same without me, but I need to apologize and accept my part in the conflict before I can return. Each time, I respond the same way. I love her. I miss aspects of our relationship, but I won't apologize for demanding basic respect. And the door is open whenever she's ready to acknowledge the harm and commit to change. So far, she hasn't taken me up on it, and I've accepted that she may never be willing or able to do the work required to have a healthy relationship with me. That acceptance hurt more than I can adequately express. The grief of losing your family of origin even when you know it's necessary for your survival, but it's also been strangely freeing. I've built a chosen family now. Friends who treat me with the respect and love I deserve. People who celebrate my successes without needing to diminish them. Who support me through struggles without using them as ammunition for future mockery. Who see me as a whole person worthy of dignity. My relationship with myself has transformed in ways I'm still discovering. I'm learning to silence the internalized voices of my family that tell me I'm not good enough, to trust my own perceptions instead of gaslighting myself, to take up space without apologizing. I've started pursuing creative projects I always wanted to try but was too afraid of my family's mockery to attempt. I've developed deeper friendships because I'm no longer so desperate for approval that I accept toxic treatment. I've even started dating again with healthier boundaries and better judgment about red flags, no longer willing to accept from romantic partners the kind of disrespect I once accepted from family. The invoice itself sits in a folder in my office, a tangible reminder of my liberation and the price of my family's behavior. Sometimes I look at it and still feel angry about the decades of abuse it represents. But more often, I feel proud of myself for refusing to be silenced, for demanding accountability, for choosing my own well-being over familial obligation. That piece of paper represents the moment I stopped being a victim and started being a survivor, the moment I transformed their weapon of mockery into a shield of self-protection. The therapy journey continues, and probably always will to some extent, because healing from decades of abuse isn't a destination, but an ongoing process. Dr. Martinez and I still work together, now focusing less on my family of origin and more on building the life I want, on developing the self-worth they tried to destroy, on creating meaning from the pain I've experienced. I've started speaking publicly about emotional abuse in families, sharing my story at support groups and online forums, and the response has been overwhelming. Thousands of people have reached out to say they relate to my experience, that they're also the family scapegoat, that they've been trying to articulate what's wrong in their families, and my invoice gave them a framework to understand it. Some have created their own versions of the invoice as a therapeutic exercise, not necessarily to send, but as a way of validating their own pain and recognizing the cumulative impact of years of mistreatment. Others have used the concept to have difficult conversations with their families, with varying degrees of success. A few have even reported that their families actually responded positively, That seeing the harm quantified in such concrete terms helped them understand the impact of their behavior in a way that emotional pleas never had. Those stories give me hope that change is possible, even if it wasn't possible in my own family of origin. Looking back on the whole experience now, 8 months after I sent that invoice and chose myself over their approval, I can see it as a turning point that had to happen. I was dying a slow death in that family dynamic, losing pieces of myself to their mockery year after year until there was almost nothing left of the real Sarah underneath all the shame and self-doubt they'd layered onto me. The invoice was my declaration of independence, my refusal to disappear, my insistence on being seen as a human being with feelings that matter rather than a punchline for their entertainment. Was it dramatic? Yes. Was it confrontational? Absolutely. Could I have handled it differently? Probably. But it was authentic to my experience and my pain, and it accomplished what I needed it to accomplish even if it didn't result in the family reconciliation some part of me still hoped for. It freed me from the prison of their expectations and the cage of my own desperate need for their approval. It gave me permission to build a life based on my own values and surrounded by people who actually treat me well. It transformed my relationship with myself from one of constant self-criticism and shame to one of growing self-compassion and respect. Most importantly, it showed me that I have the strength to stand up for myself even when everyone I've known my whole life tells me I'm wrong, that my perception of reality is valid even when others try to gaslight me into doubting it, that I deserve better than what I'd been accepting for 3 decades. So here's what I want you to understand, if you're reading this and seeing yourself in my story. If you're the one your family mocks and dismisses and diminishes while calling it love. Your pain is real and valid, even if they tell you you're too sensitive. The harm they're causing is genuine abuse, even if they insist it's just jokes and you need to lighten up. You deserve respect and dignity from your family, not because you've earned it through perfect behavior, but because you're a human being. And that's the baseline of how humans should treat each other. You don't owe anyone unlimited access to hurt you just because you share DNA with them. Setting boundaries with family isn't selfish or cruel. It's necessary self-preservation. You're not crazy for recognizing dysfunction even when everyone around you pretends everything is normal. Your feelings matter, your experiences are valid, and you have the right to demand better treatment or remove yourself from situations where that better treatment isn't forthcoming. The people who truly love you will respect your boundaries even if they don't fully understand them. The people who refuse to respect your boundaries are telling you that their comfort matters more to them than your well-being. Believe them, and act accordingly. If you've experienced similar dynamics in your own family, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Share what you're going through, how you've handled it, what boundaries you've set or are working towards setting. Let's create a community of people who refuse to be their family's punching bags anymore, who support each other in choosing health over harmony, who validate each other's pain when our families refuse to. If this story resonated with you, if it helped you feel less alone in your struggle, or gave you courage to start setting your own boundaries, please leave a like on this video because it tells me that sharing these difficult, vulnerable experiences is worthwhile and reaches people who need to hear it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, real experiences from real people who've survived difficult family dynamics and come out stronger on the other side, subscribe to Living Through It because that's what we do here. We share the messy, complicated truth about family relationships, mental health, healing, and survival. We don't sugarcoat it or pretend everything is fine when it's not. We tell the truth, we validate each other's pain, and we support each other in building lives we actually want to live. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss future stories. Because trust me, you're not alone in this struggle, and together we're building a community of people who refuse to suffer in silence anymore. Remember, choosing yourself isn't selfish, setting boundaries isn't cruel, and demanding respect from your family isn't asking for too much. You deserve better than being a punching bag, and it's never too late to start standing up for yourself the way I finally did. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being part of this community. And remember, you're living through it, but you don't have to live through it alone.